Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Casey. This is the book for the day. Hi. It seemed in keeping with the theme that this should be the most visually stimulating episode that I've done, so it won't be me sitting here for most of it. I hope you enjoy the visuals, which are mostly art from the late 19th century, like the book, and flowers from my backyard, which are sort of my personal highest aesthetic pleasure. Again, enjoy the visuals. So, channel update. I'm still reading Paradise Lost. I got my copy of the Pythagorean source book as recommended by Arval, so I'm getting into that. I'm always still reading Herodotus, as well as the Bible. I'm considering an episode on the book of Job, for instance. But I'm in the mood to consider Nietzsche, and so I'm also skimming back through Zarathustra, which I've read a couple of times already, but maybe not all the way through in 10 years. I recently posted a video short where I read from the beginning of Zarathustra, and that video was inspired by a funny personal life moment that I want to relate. The other day, I was sitting on the couch with my wife and children. We were watching a cooking show. I think it's like the British baking show or something. And one of the judges described one of the French pastries as decadent. And my daughter, 11, asked me what decadent means. Or actually, she just said it out loud. What does decadent mean? And my wife raced to the answer and said, it means extra rich and sugary, usually. And I said, this is where I was reading some book, not really paying attention, but I looked up and I was like, well, actually, decadent has something to do more with like decline or especially in terms of moral values. And my wife was like, what? Just shut up. You're just going to confuse her. And I was like, no, you're confusing her. And we almost got in a fight. So the question is, basically what is decadence? How do we recognize it? What does it mean? And how is it that American television commercials have turned it into seemingly a positive word when historically it didn't have positive connotations? See, in the Nietzsche video, I tried to, I wanted to post portraits. So I tried to post almost random portraits from the various decades between about 1450 and 1950. And what I see when I look at that video short is a decline. I see a decline in beauty in terms of the art, in technique, and even in the physiognomy of the faces that are being represented in the portraits. Now, Nietzsche lived right in the middle of this period that I'm talking about today, so the late 19th century. And what's interesting to me is that while he was blowing the clarion call for a superman, an ubermensch, an overman, the reality is things appear to have been moving in quite the opposite direction. And this is interesting. It's like Nietzsche seems to be, he's calling for and this makes sense. It's like a generation after Darwin, so people are thinking about evolution and the species, and does it have a telos, and those kinds of questions. And, it makes sense what he's thinking, I guess, but it's a progressive narrative, right? He's still in line with the idea that, things are getting better all the time. What I see, and this is why I put a 15th or maybe it was early 16th century portrait last after showing you the progression from 1450 to 1950, is to suggest that no, maybe we're not progressing as a species towards the overman. In fact, if anything, maybe Leonardo da Vinci was the overman. You know what I mean? In other words, it's like how do you say that word with the V in it? Return, is maybe the best we can do at this point. Now, so that's sort of what got me thinking about decadence and the late 19th century. Now, when I used to teach world literature, which I often did, I always made it a point to zero in on Baudelaire and Rimbaud, to speak about French decadent art and literature. And it was fun to show them paintings from the period and to watch the development of things like Impressionism, Expressionism, and the symbolism that we'll talk about in a minute here, and compare it to some of the literature that Baudelaire and Rimbaud and others, it would be like Leon Bloy and I'm blanking on who else here, but like those are the kinds of names that you would find in the decadent period. Okay, so that's all a really interesting conversation because it provokes people in just the right way. Basically forcing them, students, who are just learning about this, to side with either the new definition of decadence or to rediscover its older meaning. And this choice generally prompts one to think about, new values versus old values in a very fathers and sons Turgenevian sort of a way. Now, in this episode, working my way up to Nietzsche, I want to continue thinking about decadence, this time by summarizing and reflecting on a less famous book, a book which is nevertheless a cult classic, especially among reactionaries and traditionalists, among Catholics in particular. And that is Against Nature, also translated as, and I like this translation better, Against the Grain, by Joris-Karl Huysmans. It was published in 1884. And it really did start a new track for French novels. It follows an anti-hero, really kind of a dandy, a very modern man called, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, I'm going to ruin the French, but like Des Essentes, I'll call him Des Essentes, I'm sure it's Des in French, Des Essentes, as he searches for the perfect stimulation to satisfy his senses. Okay, so that's kind of the premise here. Now, before I say anything else about the novel, I want to say a few things about France in the second half of the 19th century. The first half was dominated by Victor Hugo, who, in my opinion, is still a great pleasure to read. I mean, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Toilers of the Sea, The Man Who Laughs, 93, and of course, Les Miserables. Hugo was a romantic, and above everything else, a poet. I love him because he really can make you cry. But, now that I'm not 22 years old, I can tell that he sort of made me cry in maybe what you might say is a little bit of a manipulative way. Sort of, deploying his downtrodden characters at just the right moments to create, like, very literary catharsis. Okay? But, starting in 1857, with the publication of Baudelaire's collection of poems called Flowers of Evil, La Fleur de Mal, which, by the way, was influenced by Poe. Starting in 1857, French literature raced away from Romanticism and towards realism. And that meant less artifice and more grit. Baudelaire was one of the first poets to truly lower poetry from the realm of the sacred and the sublime to, well, the profane, to the realm of the brothel and the opium den. And this was justifiable, of course, maybe even necessary, in the same way that like Dickens was necessary in England or Mark Twain in America to give the aristocracy a glimpse of the life of the commoners, ugly as it sometimes was. Okay, so that was the realist movement there. This isn't neat. These distinctions aren't neat, and the timeline isn't quite neat. But basically, early 19th century was romantic, and then we're moving toward something closer to realism, and then what follows was called naturalism, and you can think of Émile Zola here. Naturalism was kind of the child of realism. It's basically all the same stuff, real things happening to real people in prose, not poetry. But now, with like an intentionally nihilistic undertone to it where, the brothels aren't even tragic anymore. The opium dens aren't even a disaster. They sort of just are. They just exist. There's no moralizing in naturalism. So just think like, ice cold reality, I guess. And it's also worth thinking about French painting around this time, which follows like a similar track, not exactly the same, but similar. Mostly to say that Huysmans strongly favored the symbolists, especially Gustave Moreau and Odilon Redon. This is a sort of painting, this kind of painting, like the symbolist painting is, it's probably fair to call it idealist. And, what do I mean by that? Well, geez, there's a lot going on in this episode. But to understand me, consider this line from Stéphane Mallarme, or Maillarme, I'm not sure how to pronounce it in French. from like one of his letters to a friend, calling for painters to, quote, depict not the thing, but the effect it produces. So, I'm going to put some images up here and continue. We'll look at some of the paintings right now. Note that symbolism was sort of headed in a different direction than Impressionism, which had made a splash in France starting around 1870. I think it's who did Impression Sunrise? I think it might have been 1867 or 71, somewhere in there. But you might say the symbolists were painting against the grain, or against the flow. I mean, hint, hint, right? Because that is the title of the Huysmans novel here. In other words, the flow was in the direction of Impressionism and then Expressionism. They were trying to do something a little bit different, and so think of Gustave Moreau here with his like ornate, usually Greek-inspired mythology stuff, and it's there's like a narrative to his paintings in ways that there weren't in looking at the lilies in who painted the lily pads all the time? The Impressionists that did that. So okay, and at the time, like, because of the way that like literary movements tend to work, and there's like an in crowd, or there's a what do they call that, the West Bank in Paris or whatever. Huysmans was supposed to be writing like Zola. You're supposed to be a naturalist in the 1880s, okay? That would have been writing with the grain, staying in his lane. The guy, Huysmans, was born in 1848, and early in his career he did follow Zola. Right, he wrote at least one story about a prostitute in 1876 and another in 1881 called Living Together, about a couple living a hard and ugly domestic life. But then came Against Nature in 1884. The title of the novel in French is notoriously difficult to translate. À rebours, meaning something like against the grain, but translated here as Against Nature. It was originally going to be titled Alone, because it features a main character, really an anti-hero, who withdraws from society in order to seek aesthetic pleasure. And why does he do this? Well, he does this because, like as we read in the prologue, quote, his contempt for humanity increased. At length he realized that, for the most part, the world is made up of scoundrels and half-wits. End quote. So when he tried college, that went badly. Quote, after a year's trial of these companions, De Sacentis was filled with an immense weariness by their excesses, which struck him as petty and facile, pursued with no discrimination, with no feverish involvement, with no genuine intense excitement of blood and nerves. End quote. So yeah, he wants more. And to seek it, he comes to believe, he must go it alone. So at the end of the prologue it says, quote, one day, without telling anyone of his plans, he sold off all his furniture, dismissed his servants, and disappeared, leaving no address with the concierge. So basically he was moving out of Paris and to the rural isolation of his house at Fontenay. But first, he spends a few weeks in the shops of Paris making a gazillion little purchases that are going to enhance the, aesthetic pleasure of his home out there at Fontenay. This is not, don't get it wrong, this is not Henry David Thoreau moving out to the country to, homestead. This is a dandy, right? It says he had the habit of dressing in suits of white velvet and gold-embroidered waistcoats. So you can picture like Elton John, basically. Okay, and then the novel starts. So basically all of chapter 1 is De Sacentis picking out colors of paint for his walls. Did you hear me? The whole first chapter is about this guy picking out the colors of paint for his walls. How funny is that? And I want you to read one of many paragraphs that you find in this chapter with me, because this paragraph will give you an idea of what you're getting yourself into when you read this novel. Not just in chapter 1, but through the rest of the book. Okay, this is hilarious to me, by the way. Listen. Quote, slowly, one by one, he sorted through the shades of color. By candlelight, blue is an almost artificial green, A dark shade of blue, like cobalt or indigo, turns black. A pale shade turns gray. A true and gentle blue, like turquoise, looks faded and lifeless. So unless it was coupled with another color as a helper, blue could not possibly be used as the predominant shade in a room. On the other hand, iron gray grows still gloomier and heavier. Pearl gray lose their azure tints and mutate into a dirty white. Browns turn lethargic and cold. As for dark greens, such an emperor green and myrtle green, they behave like bright blues and merge into shades of black. That left the paler greens, like peacock green, the vermilions, and the reddish-brown lacquers, but light washes out their blue tones, leaving behind only the yellow ones, which themselves then appear spurious and murky. I mean, I love that. If you love that, you'll love this book. I love the description of like a yellow paint as being spurious. That's very funny. The thing is, it's hard to tell whether this sort of paragraph immersed in a chapter that is basically more of the same in a book where the next chapter is of the same style, but instead of selecting paint colors, it's about selecting houseplants or whatever. It's, again, hard to tell whether all of this is supposed to be a joke or a farce or a parody or what. Because, of course, the reality is the author himself must have, at least at some point, made a note of all these sorts of things in order to write it, which suggests that such a man could actually exist, which is both hilarious and fascinating. So this novel is definitely an aesthete's literary paradise. And I think one has to be an elitist, sort of unapologetically, to really enjoy the novel. A disdain for low and unrefined taste, an inclination to avoid nouveau riche people, and an attraction to something more than perfectionism, something approaching idealism, really, seem to characterize the protagonist. At the end of chapter 2, we read, quote, "The sight of certain physiognomies caused him actual suffering, and he saw almost as insults the benevolent or peevish expressions on certain faces, feeling an urge to box the ears of, for example, this gentleman who strolled along half closing his eyes in a learned manner, or of that one who rocked back and forth on his heels while gazing admirably at his own reflection, or of yet a third who seemed prey to 1,000 concerns, as with furrowed brow he pored over the long-winded articles and the news reports in a daily paper. De Sanctis could smell the presence of such ingrained stupidity, of such loathing for what he himself believed in, of such scorn for literature, for art, for everything that he himself adored, implanted and firmly rooted in these shallow tradesmen's brains. Brains preoccupied exclusively with swindles and money, and accessible only to that ignoble distraction of mediocre minds, politics." I mean, honestly, I do love that. I understand that some of my, roughneck listeners who are proud of the calluses on their hands would call this gay, or at the very least roll their eyes at it. And actually, I mean, the author himself might ultimately be doing something complicated here. Maybe the protagonist is not the author, so read carefully. But the thing is, underneath the condescension, consider what it is that's driving De Sanctis here. He is an idealist. He wants more than money. He wants beauty with a capital B, and he won't accept substitutes. Chapter 3 is all about his books. It's literally a study guide for the classics. I mean, it's not a narrative. Nothing happens in this chapter. And I mean that in a good way. He mentions all the classics: Virgil, Homer, Lucretius, Catullus, Ovid, Horace, Sallust, Livy, Suetonius, Tacitus. And by the way, he dismisses many of these as spineless or lethargic or turgid or sentimental and pompous, which is very funny to me because, of course, to have an opinion about any of that, you have to read it all, right? His favorite author seems to have been Petronius, who is best known for his Satyricon, which I haven't yet read fully, but I intend to, of course, for the podcast soon-ish. But the description here says that Petronius, quote, "laid out before the reader the everyday existence of the common people, with its incidents, its savagery, its lusts. So this is sort of interesting because, I mean, this suggests a parallel to the naturalist period in French literature, which was in vogue at the time. The narrator, I guess, goes on to discuss at great length the works of the church fathers in this chapter also. So Tertullian gets a few paragraphs, and Jerome gets a few, and so on. Now, this is really a compendium of the grand classical readings. It's hardly more of a narrative than the cetology chapters in Moby Dick, and I, for that reason, endorse it. Huysmans has smuggled into what is ostensibly a novel a short essay on the essentials of a reading curriculum for gentlemen. The next chapter is, I'm not kidding, about flowers, which are more precious to De Sanctis than gems, but sort of tragically, I think, he's really into fake flowers, and this is probably my only complaint about the novel, and I think it's likely just an accident or, like an anomaly here. Apparently, fake flowers were all the rage in France at the time, and so they probably seemed really interesting to people. There is some interesting rhetoric in the book about how man's ingenious has outstripped nature. So maybe this is part of the theme of the book, or part of the problem. We're getting to that. I mean, what's the conflict in this book, right? You've got this guy who's just picking out paint colors and flowers. But my own taste is strongly against fake flowers and houseplants that are fake, so I had a harder time enjoying that chapter, I gotta admit. But I will say, some of the stuff is so freaking hilarious because I cannot believe anyone had the temerity to write these sentences with a straight face. Listen again. Quote, De Sanctis was also of the opinion that the correlation could be extended and that string quartets could perform under the palatial vault, with the violin represented by fine old liquor brandy, smoky, pungent, and delicate, rum, being more robust, more sonorous and rumbling, took the part of the viola, vesper, heart-rendingly, long-drawn-out, melancholy and caressing, was the cello, while an old, pure bitter stood in for the double bass, vigorous, solid, and black. One could even, if one wanted to form a quintet, add a fifth instrument, the harp, which was very closely imitated by the vibrant flavor and aloof, high-pitched, silvery note of dry cumin. I mean, that is a hilarious paragraph, comparing dry cumin to a harp. It literally makes me LOL. I couldn't think... I mean, if you gave me 1,000,000 years, I couldn't think of an analogy like that. And you guys know how I love analogies. That one's just really choice. Okay, the next chapter is about paintings, with a lot of space given to describing and analyzing Gustave Moreau's work. The one with Salome dancing is given extra paragraphs here. He also seems to love the work of Odilon Redon, as I said. I mean, again, not much happens in terms of a plot. Like, he spends so much time alone that he seems to spiral down into a depression, except he's an idealist, and so it's more of like a melancholy. And I think this begins to, first it profoundly troubles him, all this navel-gazing, this introspection. But then it seems to start to chip away at his skepticism. He realizes that the Catholic Church was the shepherd of almost all of these aesthetic things that he loved, the books, the art, the music, and so on. The institution of Roman Catholicism was the ark, so to speak, that carried all the things that made life seem tolerable to him. But at the same time, he is acquainted with Schopenhauer's work, and so it's not an easy corner for him to turn. He reads about mysticism, is fascinated, but then kind of recoils because it's so abstract, it's so detached from the world, it's so uninterested in, flower cultivars, right? And look, I know all of this is a little indulgent, I get it, but if you understand this as a reaction against the French Decadent period, then it makes some sense. I mean, well, first of all, I hope you watched my short from Baudelaire, where you heard that poem called To the Reader. That gives you a sense of what the decadent side of Paris was like in, I guess, 1857, in the generation leading up to Against Nature, okay? But like, look at this tweet from some libtard I saw last week where he makes the claim that anyone who doesn't like modern art and prefers traditional art is probably a Nazi. I mean, come on. At this point, I mean, well, whatever, right? Like, I'm not gonna. You guys know what I think about that. It's ridiculous. Okay, then in the novel, the main character gives up alcohol. He gives up coffee and tea. Because he's getting like sick or weak. He tries effusions of cold water, which whatever, I don't know. Tried to take some walks, to improve his health. Basically, he's becoming sick. And he's no longer able to intoxicate himself, whether with alcohol or drugs or with all these sensory stimulants. So, the paintings, the music, and so on. He's kind of chasing the dragon. And finally, of course, he tries something like sex. I mean, there's this scene at a brothel, and it's weird and cringe to read. I think it's in chapter 9 or 10. He picks this woman who is almost masculine, and because she's almost masculine, like muscular, strong, but then in bed it says she, quote, displayed a puritanical restraint and none of those rough athletic propensities which he both desired and feared. So, in the end, nothing is really stimulating Decadentes anymore the way that that things used to. Okay, and this is the final conundrum of the book. Like, this is the central conflict, right? It's like, basically, how's he going to get off? I mean, at least mentally, right? Okay. Also, I should mention, I mean, this is the first book in a connected series of 4 books where it's like with the same protagonist. And at the end of it, in the course of those 4 books, apparently he converts to Catholicism and eventually becomes a monk. So that gives you some idea of what's going on here, right? And so, I mean, so this book really is kind of, it's moral reactionaryism, but it comes from a place not of judgment and like puritanicalism, but from like searching the stimulation that you want and then not being able to find it. And so it's like you take up the ascetic life, or like the sort of like the Stoic life, I guess, or the Christian life, the Catholic, eventually the monk's life, because none of the things in the world are stimulating enough, finally, right? This is because this is what it's like to be an idealist, okay? All right, then he goes into a very long tangent about Baudelaire. It's really good and interesting, about how literature before Baudelaire, not counting Poe, who gets a nice little shout out here, but basically literature before Baudelaire had been a catalog of what he calls perfectly healthy manifestations of virtues and vices, orderly operations of brains that conformed to the common mold, practical exemplifications of accepted ideas. So that's literature, until 1857 or whatever. But then he says, correctly, importantly, quote, Baudelaire had gone further. He had descended to the very bottom of the inexhaustible mine, had journeyed along abandoned or uncharted tunnels, eventually reaching those regions of the soul in which the nightmare growths of human thought flourish. He had exposed the morbid psychology of the soul, which has reached the autumn of its capacity to feel. Okay, so yeah, right? And that's all true, and I hope you watch that short I just posted from Baudelaire to get a sense of this. The idea there is that, in case maybe you should read the poem, actually, if you really want to get this. But the idea of that poem is that boredom, what the French called ennui, is driving people deeper and deeper into vice. Because, this better feel relevant to you in 2021, right? Like, basically, people have this tendency to seek something, anything that will stimulate their senses so that they don't have to be bored, so that they don't have to, face the abyss of self, I guess. And this is why every time you get anxious or you're alone or whatever, you look at your phone and you distract yourself by just trivialities, right? And like I said, to get a better idea of this, you should watch my archived episodes on Poe and or on Romans chapter 7. which are, I can't remember what episodes they are, but just rewind. Okay, so at this point in the novel, you've got a protagonist that is clearly falling apart. He's sick, he's depressed, and the vices and sensuous indulgences aren't even doing the trick anymore. So basically, I mean, this is where Huysmans presents Catholicism as a balm. And to be honest, as literature goes, it's a little didactic for my taste. It's a little on the nose. And the solution doesn't quite resonate with me, the last true Protestant, I guess. But it certainly does for Catholics. And as much as an outsider can, I think I understand that. In chapter 14, nearing the end of the novel, the narrator says, quote, "In brief, since leaving Paris, De Sanctis was moving further and further away from reality, and especially from the contemporary world which inspired an ever-growing disgust in him. This aversion had necessarily affected his literary and artistic tastes, and he distanced himself as much as possible from pictures and books whose limited subjects related to modern life." What that means, he's not watching Netflix or the news anymore, right? He's not looking at Twitter anymore. He only wants to be in touch with the eternal. So the Christianity that draws him to it is specifically a Christianity that is that is against the grain or against the world, right? You understand? Not the Christianity that we see in strip malls where the facade of the church might be mistaken for a Target or a Walmart, where the ministers wear clothes they bought at Forever 21. I mean, this has been driving me crazy actually lately. Like, I've noticed even I respect and admire and get it what these people at the SSPX or the traditional Latin Mass people are doing with their attempt to find something traditional. But one thing you'll notice about them, they all dress like business people. Very American capitalist aesthetic. Now I'm talking about the men, because some of the women wear the veil, which is an interesting signifier. But I'm not convinced there's enough, we need a Christianity that's as radically weird looking as Orthodox Judaism, for instance. Think of the way that it signals opposition to the empire if you wear a kippah and tzitzit and peyos on the side of your head, right? Then people see you and they know you're a freak relative to, Netflix values or whatever, okay? And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of Christianity that I think we need more of, because that provides people the exit strategy they're looking for. Then they feel, okay, now I'm not just an empire dweller. I'm not just an empire bug. I'm something else, right? I'm a Christian. And look at how I dress, and look at how this makes me different. This sets me apart. Anyway, this is something to think about. I'm going to end this episode by reading you the last 3 paragraphs in just a moment here. Look forward to the next episode on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Give me about a week on that one. I'd like to do a pretty good job on it. Okay, thanks for listening to this one. Hit me up on Twitter at Godward16 if you have ideas for the podcast, or take a look at my Patreon page. The link is always in the description. All right, here we go. Here are the last 3 or 4 paragraphs of Joris-Karl Huysmans' Against Nature. Okay, so then comes these last 3 paragraphs, and he's basically collapsing into really bad health, and this is sort of the beginning of the conversion moment. So it goes like this. A fit of rage, like a fierce gale, swept away his efforts at resignation, his attempts at indifference. He could no longer deceive himself. There was nothing left. Everything had been brought down. The bourgeoisie sat about on the ground, as though on a Sunday outing, stuffing themselves from paper bags, amid the majestic ruins of the church, which had become a place of assignation, a pile of debris, defiled by contemptible jibes and infamous jokes. Surely, in order to prove their existence beyond any doubt, surely the terrible God of Genesis and the pale crucified Christ would revive the cataclysms of the past, reignite the rain of fire that once consumed those cities of the damned, those abodes of death long ago. Was it possible that this filth would continue to flow, and with its pestilence swamp this old world in which nothing now grew save seeds of iniquity and harvests of shame? The door opened suddenly. In the distance, framed by the doorway, appeared men dressed in cocked hats, with clean-shaven cheeks and little tufts of hair on their chins, heaving packing cases and moving furniture. Then the door closed again behind the servant, who was carrying out some parcels of books. Exhausted, De Sescentis collapsed into a chair. "In 2 days' time I shall be in Paris," he exclaimed. "It really is all over. The waters of human mediocrity, like a tidal wave, are rising up to the sky and will engulf this haven whose sea walls I have with my own hands most unwillingly breached. Ah, my courage fails me, and I am sick at heart. Lord, take pity on the Christian who doubts, on the unbeliever who longs to believe, on the galley slave of life who is setting sail alone, at night, under a sky no longer lit, now by the consoling beacons of the ancient hope."